One of the mechanisms or the factors effecting or bringing about evolution, the processes of evolution. Clearly, natural selection, which is Darwin's great contribution to science, is primary here. But there are other explanations that have come about since Darwin, which help us to understand the process of evolution. We also look at the patterns of evolution. How has the tree of life branched through time? Plants, animals, primates, carnivores, whatever. All forms of life have engaged in this branching and splitting kind of phenomenon that we call common ancestry or descent with modification. The big idea of evolution is a core idea of science. Common ancestry is one of these ideas in science that we're really not arguing about in the world of science. Scientists are not sitting up wondering whether living things had common ancestors. This is a done deal. At this university, every other university, and the good sectarian universities as well. If you go to Brigham Young, you will be taught that living things descended with modification from common ancestors. If you go to Baylor, you will learn evolution happened. Living things have common ancestors. If you go to Notre Dame, if you go to Texas Christian, you go to any number of well-regarded sectarian institutions, you're going to learn the same science that you learned here. We're not arguing about the weather. Now, the process and the patterns of evolution is the frontier, the details. This is what we are arguing about. And actually, we have a lot of agreement on the basics, but this is where science is growing, and this is where evolutionary biology is growing. So that, in a nutshell, is evolution. It's the branching and splitting of species through time, the big idea of common ancestry, which we understand by studying the process and the pattern. Now, why is this important? Well, the reason why evolution is important to know about has to do with a very famous statement by a Nobel laureate and generally cool guy, Richard Feynman, who was talking about physics students who could recite all the formulas but who couldn't think like a physicist. He said the students had memorized everything, but they didn't know what anything meant. A very famous geneticist wrote an article in the American Biology Teacher back in the 70s. The title of it was "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." Now, inside he wrote, "Seen in the light of evolution, biology is perhaps intellectually the most satisfying and inspiring science. Without that light, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole." I think what Dobzhansky meant by "nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution" is that evolution, the idea of common ancestry, tells you why things are like they are instead of some other way. That is a very important way of understanding making sense. For example, take a look at the forearm of vertebrates, okay? The forearm of vertebrates has one bone close to the body, two bones a little further from the body, a whole bunch of little bones here at the wrist, and then a spray of bones, the hand bones and the finger bones. This is true of every land vertebrates. This is true of mammals, of reptiles, of birds, of amphibians, and of, did I leave anything out? I think that's it. The whole bunch of them. And this is true whether that forelimb is used for swimming, for digging, for flying, for running PowerPoints, whatever. The same series of bones are modified to make a wing, or modified to make a digging apparatus, or modified to make a fin, as in the case of whales. What's the best explanation? That primates and carnivores and whales and bats all had a separate modification of the best forelimb structure for that particular function? Well, no, not really. If you wanted to design a wing, you wouldn't take, pardon me, this is not a rude gesture, you wouldn't take a finger bone and extend it 5 times longer than an arm bone. That's kind of a kludgy way of making a wing. It makes much more sense to consider that this particular assortment of bones in the forelimb of land vertebrates arose from common source. Common ancestry makes sense of this pattern of of forelimb development. And actually, when we look at the fossil record, we find very early land vertebrates, and actually we even find some of the aquatic vertebrates that were making the transition to land have the same one bone here, two bones here, a bunch of little bones here, and a spray of bones there. And we even find some very good fossils like the recently discovered Tiktaalik that shows that as well. Let's talk about cells. Cells are a fun thing to talk about. Why are things the way they are instead of some other way? Well, cells make sense also if you consider that cells have an evolutionary history as well. Living things can be divided into three domains: the archaea, the bacteria, and the eukarya. The eukarya, by the way, cells come in two kinds. Prokaryotes, which are cells which have no separate nucleus. The DNA, that little green junk in there, is sort of just floating around all by itself. This includes two of those major domains, the bacteria and the archaea. Then there's another kind of cell called a eukaryote. And the eukaryotes are the third domain of life. And the eukaryotes have a nucleus in which the DNA is found. And they have a number of other parts that are slightly distinct from prokaryotes, but really there's a lot of similarity between them. But I want to take a look at a sort of a model eukaryotic cell, and I want to point to something called a mitochondria. Among the organelles of a eukaryote are these things called mitochondria. Now, these are pretty important parts of the cell because in your typical eukaryotic cell, about 1/5 of the weight of the cell is these mitochondria. So they're doing something pretty important. And actually they do. They generate a chemical called ATP out of cell nutrients, and this powers the metabolic activity of the cell. And so this is a pretty important thing. Mitochondria were discovered in the 1800s. And it was noted back in the 1800s when they were first discovered that they looked kind of like bacteria, these funny little things floating around in the cell. They didn't quite know what they did until the 20th century, but you know, they looked kind of bacterioid when they were examined under the early microscopes. In the 20th century, mitochondria were explored in much greater detail, and it was discovered that they have DNA. This is really weird. Why would mitochondria have DNA? The nucleus of the eukaryote has DNA. The nucleus of the DNA and the nucleus of the cell is what's responsible for cell division and reproduction and all that kind of stuff. What is the superfluous DNA doing in an organelle? No other organelles have DNA. This is really weird. Why would an organelle in a eukaryotic cell have its own DNA, which reproduces separately from nuclear DNA? Now, similarly, plant cells can generate energy from photosynthesis, from chloroplasts, which are organelles within plant cells. Now, chloroplasts also have their own DNA. This is really weird. Why would these little funny organelles have their own DNA independent of the DNA in the nucleus? Well, Lynn Margulis hypothesized in, I think, the 1970s, that mitochondria are actually aerobic bacteria that were engulfed by an early anaerobic cell, but not digested. And a symbiotic relationship developed between that engulfed bacteria and the cell, in which they scratched each other's backs, so to speak. Similarly, chloroplasts in eukaryotic plant cells, which are similar to cyanobacteria, which are photosynthesizing prokaryotes, might also have been engulfed by early ancestors of plant cells and become the ancestors of modern-day plants. So her hypothesis was that eukaryotes are therefore composites of other structures. They incorporate bacteria and chloroplasts. Now that was a hypothesis. That was an idea that she threw out. It had some support for it. It was very controversial. People argued against it. People argued for it. People went out and started looking for evidence to prove or disprove the endosymbiotic, love that phrase, the endosymbiotic hypothesis of Lynn Margulis. It took a long time, but eventually enough data were gathered so that pretty much everybody agreed that something like that was very important in the evolution of eukaryotic cells. One bit of confirmation, in fact, was in the 1970s when molecular biologists like Ford Doolittle and Carl Woese sequenced the DNA of mitochondria and found that it was quite